Hello, everyone. Thank you for agreeing to participate in this panel. I know I contacted some of you last minute, so I apologize about that, and hope that we're going to have some good discussions. Maybe we get in some arguments. That'd be kind of cool, but we'll see. So I think let's just start with introductions, though. I'm Everett Hildenbrandi. I'm CTO at Runtime Verification. Super stoked about ETH Denver. I have really been enjoying the conversations I'm having with people here. It feels like a nice audience, people who are actually excited about the space. So that's me. And so when you do your introduction, who you are, your role, the company you're at, something you're stoked about at ETH Denver. Maybe you're not stoked about anything, but hopefully you are. So.
All right. My name is Michael Lewellen. I'm the head of solutions architecture at Open Zeppelin. The things that I'm really excited about at ETH Denver are a lot of talks about account abstraction. I'll be doing a panel with ZK Sync about that, which is one of our fun partners. And then just generally seeing how people hack and build things. We do have a bounty program for our security platform Defender. So if you're able to build something and show it off, then there's money on the table for you, about $10,000 in prizes. Otherwise, just excited to see what I might not expect.
All right. As I was introduced, so my name is Vincent, Director of Engineering at BlockSwap. Many things we're excited about. We've got an event on Friday, March 3rd in the Source Hotel. And it's very interesting. The previous one of the previous talks that was on from the CEO of Block Native, because we're going to be talking about PBS. It's not actually 3 to 4 years away. It's actually sooner than that. We're going to talk about bridging, restaking, and many other things. So, but this panel is really important because we care deeply about security at BlockSwap. It's a core focus of everything that we do. Like I say, we take it very seriously. So.
Hi, I'm Jon. I was just up there, but I'll reintroduce myself. I am the CTO and a co-founder of Veritice, and so what I've been excited about at ETH Denver is one, sharing what we've been working on and getting people's feedback, but also just seeing what other people are building, particularly because people like coming up to us and telling us what they're building in the ZK space, and there are some cool applications that I've heard about, so that's interesting.
Hey everyone, I'm Yi. I'm one of the founders of Axiom. We're building a ZK coprocessor for Ethereum. And as part of that, we're launching our open source program at ETH Denver. So if you want to apply to build open source ZK circuits with us, go to our website at axiom.xyz/open-source.
Cool. Thank you, everyone, for the nice introductions. I just want to let everyone know this is an incredible and diverse set of people we have up here. We have several builders up here. We have infrastructure. We got people who know about ZK. We got people who know about MEV. So I think this should be a pretty interesting panel going on right now. So the title of the panel is Security Lifecycle, which is a field that a lot of us have been kind of in for a long time. But I think, what does security lifecycle mean for you guys? It used to mean, in 2018, that you phoned up your friend at the Ethereum Foundation and were like, hey, can you check out these contracts for me? It's evolved a lot since then. What does it mean now from your guys' perspectives?
All right, I'll jump in first and say it's a longer process, and it's not just because you have a long wait time for audits. There's also a lot to consider early on, and that's mainly just because of mistakes we figured out. The ecosystem has figured out, such as anticipating how you want your access control set up. Do you want your contracts to be upgradable? If they are upgradable, how are you going to govern the powers of it? Are you going to be multi-chain? And just the fact that the EVM is not as static as it used to be, or at least not as much as we expect. It's there's an expectation that most applications are going to move to L2s, that they might have to make changes. And within that, you have to think about what am I building for today, and then what am I going to have to anticipate in the future, and kind of find the right bite-sized chunk that you're going to approach. And then from a security perspective, just think about all the threats you're going to face early on, map them out, and try to plug as many of them in your MVP as possible. And for those that you're not plugging, have a plan to ensure it's not a problem for early users. So that's just to say, think a lot as you develop and as you get closer to release. Plan ahead to have both auditors as well as other quality assurance methods in place and already ready to check your code. So you're not scrambling before release to get everything audited. And then once you're deployed, having a plan to just make sure things continue to be safe and you actually actually have your users protected, and you're aware of that by having monitoring and incident response and a lot of other fun things we'll probably talk about more.
Let's use this microphone. I think that one's feeding back.
Yeah, so I think Michael's touched on a good point that as an industry, things have had to be figured out along the way. Certain patterns that wouldn't be a problem in non-blockchain contexts, things like re-entrancy of functions. Normally, if you're maybe coding in Java or Python, so re-entering a function is not going to cause you a problem. But when you consider that there is normally state that will govern how much tokens, for example, might be distributed to a user, if you re-enter the contract in the right way, you might be able to drain the contract before it can update its state correctly. So it's patterns like that that make developing on within the EVM really difficult, or not even just the EVM. At the end of the day, Solidity is a Turing-complete language, so you have enormous power, and it's really how you manage that. So at BlockSwap, we have the processes that we've followed internally have evolved over time, and we are integrating more and more formal approaches. So what we're doing is starting the formalization of our protocols, our smart contract-based mechanisms as early as possible. And so that means writing formal models, and at a high level that just basically describes sort of what are the invariants of the system, how is the system expected to operate, because the way you may have implemented your smart contracts isn't necessarily how you expect the system to operate. So it's kind of, and smart contracts are incredibly complex, much more complex than, like you said, Everett, in 2018. You might be able to, look at one contract, but now there's multiple. So it's really just distilling down your system to what are the core invariants, what things should always be true, and how can things go wrong. So it's making something complex, simplified, and then, but we always find really that it always delivers the good. So we work with partners like Runtime to also help us in the formal process, and we really find that it delivers good results.
Yeah, I mean, I like it when I hear someone talking about developing invariants, because that's something that a lot of people don't do. And so I think there's kind of a discrepancy between the ideal security lifecycle and the one that's actually implemented by a lot of these projects, because ideally what someone will do is they will evaluate the security concerns that they have when choosing a chain, and so because different chains have different trade-offs, and then as they start building the projects, they do start thinking about the invariants that they think should hold within those projects and documenting them, and then also integrating various tools in order to check them. And so we've seen, or at Veridice, we've seen a couple of like very high quality projects that have kind of used this development life cycle where from the very beginning they thought about security and checking these invariants using the tools that were available to them before they approached us. And while we found bugs in their project still, it made it, one, a lot easier, and two, kind of took away that low-hanging fruit. And so testing is a major, or testing and using other tools is a major way of finding these bugs. And it's been proven in the past that it's required in order to actually have a robust project, because auditing can only do so much. Like auditing plus testing is really a way to get robust security. And so after, that, either engaging someone for an audit, because it's always good to have another set of eyes looking at your code, or making it publicly available in some way and providing bounty programs to incentivize people to look at it. And then, it doesn't really stop there, because a lot of the people continue to build on top of their protocols after they release. And so they have to, this is a continuous process where people need to make sure they follow proper security protocols the entire way through. And so that's the ideal. However, in practice, basically what happens is someone has a cool idea, other people are implementing the same thing, so they're rushing to get to market, they've got pressure from investors or something like that, and so they implement something really quickly, they don't have time to do all of the tests, they've got, like 50% coverage, that's sufficient, right? And then I'll send it to my auditors will find the rest of my bug, and then I'll put it on the blockchain, and then everything will probably be fine. And so this is what it would be nice to get away from, and move closer towards the ideal.
Yeah, so I think the other three panelists have given some really good points, mostly pertaining to smart contract systems. So I thought I'd add a couple of the concerns we think about at Axiom that are more special to ZK. So I think when you contrast ZK security to smart contract security, I would say one big differentiating feature is that the tooling and frameworks for ZK are a lot less mature. And as a consequence, there are many more ways to shoot yourself in the foot. And honestly, we think that the best way to guard against this is to write less code. So that can either be less functionality or to write code that's more expressive. So we spent a lot of time writing a new framework for Halo 2, which lets us write the same functionality in much fewer lines of code. And we think that's both a win for developer velocity, but also for security. The other aspect, which I think is a bit unique in ZK, is that you're frequently using much more novel cryptographic protocols. And we think it's really important to just check through all of the assumptions that are required for those protocols and make sure that your integration with your smart contract actually checks everything. This is, it's a rather trivial type of check compared to writing the full ZK circuit, but we found that actually these are places where we find the most bugs internally.
Thank you, everyone, for those detailed answers. I want to talk to Vince and to Yi because you both have deployed on-chain code, right? And so you both are builders. In the case of Vince, you have the whole block swap system. In the case of Yi, you have your on-chain systems for validating the proofs that are done off-chain, the zero-knowledge proofs that are done off-chain. One thing that we've seen a lot in the last year, and one thing that we definitely promote at Runtime Verification, I know several other firms are as well, is this shift-left mentality to security, which is the idea that more security moves in-house, more tools are provided to the clients, and you also touched on this, John, a bit, where the client should be coming to you having already done all the due diligence that they can before going to the audit. You can't treat the auditor as a magic box that's going to find all the bugs, right? You have to do your own due diligence ahead of time. So I want to ask Vince and Yi, what does this shift left mean for you? How is that translated to actual practices that you're putting in at your firms?
Yeah, no, it's definitely we try and do as much as possible in-house to give us the ability to, it's a number of things. So iterations is one thing. So I liked what Yi said about writing less code. And if you have, the right tools, if you have hopefully the formal modeling, the implementation doesn't really matter that much. You can actually start with something that's maybe bigger than it should be. And if you have the right tools, you can iterate and you can check that the system is still behaving as you expect. Now, the other issue as well is, there's all sorts of things to sort of you have to watch out for in your blind spots. And one big blind spot that I don't think a lot of people talk about much about is compiler bugs in Solidity. So compiler bugs in Solidity are more commonplace than you think. There are various companies and tools such as so I think it's Data. They've got a library of vulnerabilities, and the Satora guys and many other people have found bugs in the Solidity compiler. Obviously, we're still early days with Solidity as a language and the ecosystem. So it is to be expected. So regardless of how good your code can be, the compiler can turn it into something that doesn't behave very nicely. So what we try and do is we try and use tools on the bytecode. So we use the Satora tool. We're working with Runtime Verification to write property testing and all these sort of tests in Foundry so that we can plug in Foundry to K. And really just sort of as the tools get easier and easier, we get sort of higher confidence on sort of our system. We eliminate the lower hanging fruit so that when we do engage the auditors, because we always need to have an outside, unbiased view on the code and what's happening, and see sort of what we have missed. Now, going to your point about deploying codes on chain and what happens after deployment, well, security is still an ongoing process. You cannot just deploy your contracts to chain and then hope for the best, really. So what we do at BlockSwap is we have monitoring and observability solutions on both the Ethereum execution layer and the consensus layer, which is something that a lot of people aren't looking at, is the consensus layer. So what we do is we say, okay, so we have these core invariants of our protocol, the Stakehouse protocol, which is a base layer protocol, where we have the maximum security, maximum formal verification. And we say that we know these properties exist, so we'll monitor them internally and get alerts when things fail. You don't want an Axie Infinity situation where the run and bridge gets hacked and 7 days later you find out, right? So you need to know as early as possible when things have gone wrong, but you also need to give the community, empower the community to figure out when things have gone wrong. So we have a monitoring dashboard. Anyone can see red, amber, green, are the properties of the system holding, and you engage the community. You make it not just internally, because internally as a company you can only do so much. So you ask community for help. You ask community for formal verification assistance. So we're engaging multiple parties on this, and it's definitely an evolving process. Something that's really interesting, and the tools are hopefully going to get better and better to help teams to do this. Because unit testing is not enough, but you need to combine a few approaches really.
Yeah, to echo what Vince is saying about being community driven, one thing we found to be very helpful is using common primitives that are shared among different projects and actually making all of our framework open source to encourage others to use the same code. We found that this just gives fundamentally different eyes on the code. And when someone is using your ZK circuits for a different purpose, it stress tests them in a way that you're going to be biased against actually seeing internally. So outside of the standard, smart contract deployment stuff, we think a lot about how open source can be used to create what we think is the highest standard of security.
I like that. I like the open source aspect of it. I think you would like that too at the Open Zeppelin contract library. I think you guys would like that as well. So I want to hear what you guys think about this shift left. For me, it means auditing companies now can focus on other things, right? We can focus on other parts of the security lifecycle as well. I want to hear, what you guys from Open Zeppelin and from Veridice think about this too.
Yeah, I mean, in short, anyone who's focusing shift left, as in they're taking security seriously long before the audit, or the audits themselves go much smoother. The reports are cleaner, they're much nicer, there are less criticals, and there's less time spent right before release trying to fix things. We occasionally have clients that, do I think have unrealistic expectations about the audits or really about their code. And usually the best response to that is, hey, next time you come to us for an audit, let's talk more about you doing maybe some preliminary code reviews. In fact, sometimes someone will come to us for an audit. We'll say, you're not ready for an audit. We'll give you a code review, which is just our version of, you don't want this published. And we also do more workshops and other things. And while we don't focus on testing frameworks as much, we definitely encourage it. And formal verification would definitely be at the top of the, this is clearly a very mature project and it's ready to go. So the sooner someone's taking that seriously and documenting and really almost codifying what the threats are and what they need to worry about, and that makes our job much easier. We can find the more nuanced, more terrifying things that a security scanner or part of their own security team couldn't find. That's what we're really good at, or other auditors would be good at, is finding the really obscure stuff, and all the low level fruits already been cleaned out, it's already gone, and we can just focus on the fun but potentially terrifying bugs. And then afterwards, what you were saying about monitoring is on point, because once you've identified the threats of what you don't want to happen, now you know what you also monitor for and you keep an eye out for. And one thing that we're trying to do more with our clients is not just test their smart contracts and then test their deployments, but then also test their monitoring. So run your whole system in a test net or in a hard fork environment, and then try to break something and then see if your monitoring actually caught it and you're able to respond and do something about it. So live your worst nightmare before you make it a reality.
Yeah, I think those are some great points, and I wholeheartedly agree with them. We've also had audits where someone has approached us way too early, and we've, after spending a couple of weeks just told them, basically you need to go back to ground zero because there's some, issues that you should have addressed well before actually coming to us. And, that's always somewhat disappointing for both parties. And so in terms of developers actually using tools and even in some cases developing their own tools, that's something that I think is fantastic that should be seen more often. So I already mentioned this other audit that we had briefly where someone, essentially they developed their own fuzzer. So they, it was really interesting. They were building on this truffle testing framework, and then they actually created a fuzzer based off of truffle that was specific to their protocol, which was super useful because it helped them identify a lot of bugs. And so, developers or let's say security wings of these larger companies developing tools that are specific to their protocol that can identify, let's say, they have an API that this should always be called before that because this is something that is specific to their protocol, and our invariance that should hold is just, it's very useful for all of the parties. And then at the very end, they can, come to us and we can find, as you said, more obscure bugs. And so I think that, part of what Veridice is trying to do, and I think probably what other people are definitely doing as well, is I think it's important to provide frameworks for these companies to come in and build on top of them and develop things that are maybe specific to their protocol and aren't necessarily going to be used for other users so that they can identify their bugs early. And so, we're at Veridice, at least, we're very interested in building these frameworks and open sourcing as much as we can in order to allow people to build on top of our tools as well.
Yeah, and you gave a very nice talk earlier about some open source ZK tools that you guys are releasing. Also, excellent answers, I think. In the normal world of smart contract development, I think most people understand the trust bases that are involved here, right? Like if you're developing Solidity code and you're using Truffle Tester, your trust base includes the Solidity compiler, right? It includes the testing harness, right? People understand this now. I think in the world of ZK, as you were saying, the tools are not nearly as developed. What does a trust base look like there from your guys' perspective on the end there?
Yeah, I would say, on top of all the normal smart contract stuff, in ZK, you're fundamentally proving the valid execution of some function. And you're doing that typically through a proof framework, maybe a library implemented in Rust. So at Axiom, we use Halo 2, which is an implementation of a cryptographic proof system. So there are sort of three new things you must trust. One is that the mathematics behind the cryptography of these new ZK protocols actually holds. So that's subject to certain academic papers. Second, you must trust that the proof system that's implementing this protocol allegedly in Rust actually implements the protocol correctly. And finally, a lot of these protocols involve certain things called trusted setups. It's a certain multi-party computation where you have a one of n trust assumption. If one of the n parties was honest, then you can actually trust the whole system. But if all n parties collude, then maybe a lot of the guarantees are broken. And so we think it's really important to document what's actually going on. These things are pretty obscure to most users. And I think it's really on the ZK industry as a whole to be very transparent about what's being guaranteed, what's not being guaranteed, and crucially, how can the user check these things for themselves? I think a really good example in general smart contracts is contract verification on Etherscan. That's a very cheap and easy way to know that what's running on chain is the code you see. There's not really such a standard in ZK yet, but I think we're working towards that as a space.
Yeah, I like it when my work's done for me, so this is great. I don't have a whole lot to add to that because that was very comprehensive. And so, I think that there's a larger trust space here because you obviously do have these additional parties that you must trust. And, the security community, or at least the security research community, is definitely trying to eliminate this. So we've already gone through trusted setups where every single time someone wanted to, let's say, launch their protocol, they had to go through this trusted setup process. And now there are some other proving systems where you only need a single trusted setup, and then that could be reused by multiple protocols. And the research community is now looking at cases where you have trustless setup. And so this is definitely improving, which really was the only thing that I wanted to add on to that.
Cool, thank you. I want to come back to post-deployment security. We were talking a little bit earlier about that. Vince, you're working at BlockSwap. You guys do a lot of internal monitoring of your tool. That's obviously very specific need, very specific use case. OpenZeppelin, closely associated with Forta. That's more generic monitoring. That's more consumer-oriented. Talk about those a little bit, how they fit into people's security lifecycle. Let's see what we can come up with.
Yeah, I guess I'll start explaining Forta because it's a weird one for some people that are new to it, and it's essentially a decentralized protocol for running security bots. So basically, you can configure your entire bot in JavaScript, put it into a Docker file. In fact, I think you can write it in other languages now, and then it'll run on a distributed network with 5 different instances. So we have redundancy, and the idea there is that's like really community-oriented monitoring. Now, there are some cases where people are like, I don't want my security monitoring entirely public. I want to know when something breaks first, not everyone else. And there are ways to both run FortiBots private or just use traditional security monitoring infrastructure. But I think what's useful there is having the ability to alert the community not just on, let's say monumentally critical severity bugs occurring, but also just like things that are suspicious, like giving the entire community a strong awareness of what's going on. And sometimes you catch things you otherwise wouldn't because not just your team is looking, but your whole community is looking. And that's usually the way you have to approach it. So, and this is also like watching access control, like who's the multi-sig, who's the DAO, decisions coming down the pipeline, keep an eye out. One of my favorite but tragic examples of DAO governance failing miserably is Beanstalk from last year. And that was a proposal that was proposed over the weekend. I think it had like a 1-day review period. And then if you get like a 2/3 majority, you can pass quorum and then immediately execute it with no time lock. And basically someone put in a proposal that let them take the whole treasury, and then they were able to do a flash loan and borrow everything and then immediately pass it. And so there's multiple things you could have saw. You could have seen a proposal, you could have had some detection to say, hey, this proposal contains a large transfer of treasury funds, and you could have seen a large borrow of funds as well to signal something was going wrong. So there's several areas they could have watched for, as well as just frankly having a better governance system in place. But that's just one example, but that's like where just awareness of how the system's working from a governance perspective is useful. And then for protocol teams, obviously having as much information as possible and getting as early an alert as possible is critical for like stopping something from going monumentally wrong.
So the Forta example is really interesting because with the Steakhouse protocol, we are dealing essentially with Ethereum refers to it as 2 layers, but obviously it was 2 chains at one point: Ethereum execution layer and consensus layer. And with the Steakhouse protocol, there aren't any oracles for updating the balances of the assets that the users are owning on the execution layers. Users are self-reporting. And this mechanism is in the audit reports from the runtime verification. Now, the challenge is knowing when between the 2 layers when something is going wrong. So when a user is reporting their balance from the consensus layer to the execution layer, we have to check both things simultaneously at once for a single contract. So the Forta side of things normally focuses on the execution layer, but the challenge with us is to have the observability across both states, and the availability of node infrastructure on the consensus side, public nodes is slim pickings, compared to execution layer. You can get sort of node information from, many sources, but it's not the case for consensus. So we're having to that tooling will hopefully develop over time for consensus layer monitoring, but we're having to sort of push the boundaries on that and sort of give users explanation. So we have when you're building something like that that's new to the industry, you need to also back that up with explanations on what you're doing. So we're having deep notes, clear documentation, technical documentation, so people that can reproduce and recalculate the same things that we're calculating, again, to get more eyes on the issues, really. So that's what we're doing on our end.
Thank you, guys. When I'm thinking of high-powered Web3 tech, I'm thinking monitoring, I'm thinking formal verification, I'm thinking property testing, I'm thinking zero-knowledge proofs, I'm thinking MEV, right? This is a bit of a curveball. I'm wondering, do you guys worry about MEV at all? Do you think about it? Do you, it kind of lies at the intersection of ZK and monitoring. A lot of zero-knowledge applications are trying to combat MEV with varying degrees of success. Monitoring is obviously very important for people who are trying to participate in MEV. They want to watch for potential opportunities to, extract value. So I know this is a bit of a curveball, so if you don't really have any comments on it, that's okay. I'm just going to down the line. What do you guys think about MEV?
It's fascinating and terrifying. I remember when I used to be the only project manager on our audit team, so I got to see a little bit of everything, including the most terrifying parts. And I do remember when both MEV as well as flash loans and other things became more common. Like, a lot of our auditing shifted from thinking like traditional security researchers and hackers to thinking like mean Wall Street traders, and that was a very different mentality to have. I think long term it's going to be good for us to figure out like how to get around it, and I think it's tricky to find permanent security solutions for, because the whole point of MEV is to constantly get more efficient and find better ways to hide bundles that you're trying to push through. I've heard of interesting security ideas around monitoring for an attack transaction and then being able to front run it yourself, which I think is cool, and I hope people continue to work on that. But I think long term, the best way to protect against MEV is to just always assume it's going to happen to your protocol and design against it.
Flash loans is when it happened, it really sent huge shockwaves through the industry, because it's a brand new paradigm that nobody saw coming. This ability to borrow any amount of money, any amount of capital in a single block that you repay, and it completely broke some protocols. Just completely obliterated them, and led to some obviously awful hacks. But it was it's a consequence of essentially composability. So what you really got to think, and we think about a lot at BlockSwap, is the composability of the protocols. How is somebody going to compose your protocol in a block, in multiple transactions, and what are the side effects of that, really? Now, it's not necessarily that it's bad. In fact, Uniswap would not function without arbitrage. So Uniswap's mechanism is a coordination-based mechanism for the market to manage the inventory of Uniswap. So Uniswap has no Oracle, no dependencies. These are things that we do internally in BlockSwap as well. We have Oracle-free dependency, and we use smart contract mechanism designs. But that means for somebody to manage your inventory, you need to pay some outside actor to manage it, and those are the arbitragers. So the arbitragers coming in and checking the virtual price against the inventory and keeping it up to date, and they're getting paid by the protocol for doing that action. So actually, that in the case of Uniswap is actually a desired action. So you really got to understand what is desired and what is not desired, and work from there, and also trying to look at how composability might affect your protocol. MEV is definitely here to stay. It's just from our perspective, it's really we're building a separate protocol, proof of neutrality. That's about more democratizing it, really. So giving more people access to the proposable to block space, really. So that's where we sit on it.
So I think that we've already kind of addressed how MEV kind of impacts you from like an auditing or security standpoint, and so I thought maybe it would be interesting to address like what it means from a tooling standpoint, because we currently don't really have very many tools that can reason about this in a very accurate way. And so what I mean by that is a lot of the tools that we have if you consider something like finding front-running attacks, it now requires that you reason about when someone submits a transaction and when it's actually mined. And so now you have to consider like this out-of-order execution, and that's something that tools have to be able to reproduce if they're, let's say, trying to produce concrete evidence of an exploit. And so that becomes a much harder problem to consider for tools because, basically, it just means that the amount of reasoning that they have to do is dramatically increased. And you have the exact same problem with flash zones because a lot of the times your tools are going to be reasoning about only your protocol in isolation. And so for that reason, we need more tools, and this is something that we've actually been working on at Veridice that can take in a larger or a broader scope of the blockchain in order to try to determine attacks on your tools. And so that requires either one, having some way or some knowledge of the blockchain state, which is very difficult, or some modeling of these types of attacks, which is the solution that we're looking at, in order to provide interesting feedback not only to, let's say, auditors using these tools, but to developers using these tools so that they can, it's easy for them to use and understand what is actually going on.
I would say MEV touches us at Axiom in two ways. First, we fulfill queries into Axiom in a way that's very similar to how oracles put numbers on chain. And so when we're working with projects, we always have to be conscious that the query fulfillment could generate quite a bit of MEV, and maybe there are ways that the protocols can design themselves to minimize that. Second, and maybe a little bit more interestingly, we're interested in ways that we can actually use Axiom to perhaps change the systems around building, proposing, or even extracting MEV. Essentially, we're able to dig into the historical transaction data on chain and post hoc maybe score people on what's the quality of the block you built, how much MEV was in the block, was there a sandwich attack in the block? And we're interested in exploring directions where that can be used to try to mitigate MEV in certain ways.
I like that data-driven approach. Look at the past data. I mean, honestly, there's just not even that good monitoring solutions for MEV. I feel like if you ask someone how much of your users' transactions are being MEV'd, probably they won't be able to answer even for their own dApp, but who knows? So we touched on a lot of topics. The topic of we're coming up on, I think, 2 or 3 minutes left. The topic of the panel was security lifecycle. Security kind of touches everything. It's, pre-deployment, at deployment time, post-deployment. We talked about a bunch of different things. Any closing remarks or anything you want to announce? Once again, I think just down the line. And obviously after the panel, you guys can ask any of these folks whatever questions you want. So,
I guess the short thing I'm excited about, which I think has a slight impact on the security lifecycle, or I think maybe a big one, but in many different ways it's hard to categorize, but account abstraction, just because I think there's going to be an announcement today about like something that the Ethereum Foundation is releasing, not changing or upgrading in the chain because you don't do that, but we did an audit of account abstraction for the Ethereum Foundation recently, and so we got to see a lot of the different ways that changes things, especially in the way that like transactions get routed by paymasters, and then the like smart wallet things you can do natively. You have better recovery mechanisms for people's wallets. You have the ability to create more native multi-sigs. You have the ability, I think, to add interesting protections both for users but also for the way they interact with protocols that I'm really excited to see. I think both in the way people now design protocols, knowing account abstraction is around, or at least when it really like gets traction, and then also like the possibilities for how you can do incident response, for how you can protect users. My favorite benchmark for crypto is like when my granddad can use it, and we can give my father like custody of his account so that anytime he's contacted by a scammer and they try to get him to send 5K somewhere, my dad can like shut it down before it actually gets sent. He has some sort of like basically an ability to like extend it to the point where it's safe for the average person to use crypto and have custody of crypto, but have some protections on top. That means they don't naively give away their funds to some hacker out there. And I think that is where I'm going to be really excited about mass adoption.
Yep. So security for us at BlockSwap is an ever-evolving situation. The the tools we use today may not necessarily be the tools that we're using tomorrow, but we're just trying to stay at the forefront of what is happening formally and not really, depending on the project, depending on the protocol that's being released. I think when it comes to smart contract security, understanding how the EVM works, basically how the execution flow is working under the hood, is really sort of advantageous. Being aware of compiler bugs and trying to get you getting better formal tools to get your sort of bugs found quicker. It's an evolving situation, so we're looking forward to seeing how it develops.
On our side, I've already touched on some of the tools that we're developing. So we're developing tools for both DeFi and ZK. So obviously, I talked about the ZK tools earlier. We'll be talking about the DeFi tools that we have coming out later or at another event. And so essentially, we're currently working on trying to figure out the best way to release these tools, because some of them will be open source, some of them will be integrated into a SaaS service. And so if you're interested in some of the stuff that we're building, please just, follow us, because we're going to be making announcements about the tooling that we're developing relatively soon.
Yeah, on our side, probably the biggest trend in ZK security we're excited about touches on what Jon mentioned, which is the intersection of shift left and formal verification. A dream of ours is to be able to formally verify our own contracts, thereby both increasing the security and speeding up our release cycle dramatically. So I think we're a long ways away, but I think tools like the ones that Veridice is developing should be a big step on that way. And last to close with, you should apply the Axiom open source program.
Okay, let's have a big thanks for our panelists, and appreciate the attention.
Great panel, by the way, guys. Really appreciate that. You guys talked about a lot of different things that projects need to be aware of. Like there's formal verification, there's unit testing, there's all these other things. So for a new project that's just starting, how do you even learn about what it is that you need to do?
Maybe I'll start with this one. I mean, that's a really good question. It's really hard to know what to do, and it requires a certain amount of personal, basically exploration right now, which isn't necessarily great. And so essentially, from our perspective, what you want to do is essentially when you decide the ecosystem that you want to participate in, right now, unfortunately, you kind of have to go and look for them, but just take a survey of the security tools that are available. I mean, in most ecosystems, the number of tools is relatively sparse, but taking advantage of as many tools as you can is always a great way to go. Obviously, you're limited in time, and so it's important to understand, one, the tools that are available, and two, the ones that will have the most impact on your protocol. And so, for example, a lot of people find a lot of use out of something like a static analyzer because it's very quick and doesn't really ever require, or it doesn't require a whole lot of configuration. And so that can provide you with very fast feedback, and it gives you actionable items. The only problem with a static analyzer is it can take up time from your developers, because now they have to go and evaluate everything that's reported by the static analyzer, as it can produce false positives. And that's where some of these other tools that you investigate might come in and have different trade-offs that are synergistic, kind of like what I was talking about earlier. So for example, you could use a fuzzer in order to attempt to find some of these vulnerabilities that were reported by the static analyzer, or if you're in a case where there is an open source automated verifier, and right now that's one area that is a little bit harder to do, because typically verification requires a lot more effort, both in terms of developing invariants and understanding what might be preventing the verification from going through. But there are cases where it might be worth having your developers, or at least maybe finding an auditor if it's a little too daunting, to go and verify the critical portions of your protocol. And so I think it's a matter of, one, exploration, and two, just trying to understand what the tools do and what you're looking for.
I just wanted to add to that all the different tooling that you mentioned is really useful, and but there is a massive learning curve to being a smart contract developer to the space. But I know from starting in sort of 2017 to now, you've gone through, like, some tools have been mentioned: Truffle, Hard Hat framework. Now the flavor of the day is the Foundry testing framework, but that is because of one, speed, and also a lot of tools being built into Foundry as a one-stop shop. So you may not know about fuzzing, but using Foundry, you may discover that, oh, it's got this feature, it's got fuzzing, it's got this. So that'll lead you to finding out about different testing approaches that you need to employ on your contracts. The other thing is that we found is really successful is engaging the community. So on education, so we ran a formal verification contest and incentivized the learning. So I think definitely the security leaders in the space should engage with community and really sort of bring to light sort of what should be done. But I think tooling should mature to the point where everything's under one roof, so that you can, because time is limited when you're developing smart contracts, and it's nice, like tools like Foundry, where you can say, right, I'll write my unit test, I'll write my property test, but I'll also fuzz, and then hopefully with Foundry 2K, you will formally verify your contracts, as well. So.
I mean, super short is there's a good resource that you can start it with which is EEA ETH Trust. There's an Ethereum enterprise group that puts together, it's just a basic list of vulnerabilities to look out for. It's categorized by stack analysis tools can catch these, a manual audit review of your code could catch these, and then these are probably where you want a real audit. And so it kind of gives you a good life cycle. And then honestly, Truffle, Hard Hat, or Foundry, although Foundry obviously has a lot of favorites on this panel. But pick one, hopefully one that your team's the most familiar with, and just start building tests and start there. And then eventually you'll hopefully evolve into something more mature. But the one thing I've seen some teams do is, I think, hesitate about which tool to go with and not actually put in the time to at least do something.
That's EEA ETH Trust, I think, right? ETH Enterprise Alliance, yeah. And they have some good guides. I think also many of the auditing companies, including Open Zeppelin, probably Veritas, actually, I looked at your website recently. I know we do. I know Trail of Bits does. Satori, they have blog posts, how to prepare for a security audit, how to test your contracts, how to write property tests, how to think about invariance. Like, it's a good resource to look at as well. Are we at time? Okay, we're at time. Let's have another round of applause for our panelists. And